Today we are learning about disjoint and overlapping events. Disjoint and overlapping events. Today's lesson, go ahead and label your notes. Alright, so there's two formulas that you need to know. The formula for disjoints is to find the probability that A or B will happen, one or the other. And the way I do that is I add their probabilities together. For overlapping events, I do the same thing, but then I have to subtract out the times where both events actually happen at the same time. So what is a disjoint event? A disjoint event has no common outcomes. No common outcomes. No common outcomes. Overlapping events have some shared outcomes. Not all, but there are some outcomes that are shared. Some shared outcomes. So that's the difference between the two. All right, so now let's look at this in more detail. All right, I'm going to give you some scenarios, and I want you to tell me, is it disjoint or overlapping? Is it possible for both of them to happen at the same time, or are they completely separate? All right, so I flip a coin. Is it possible for event A that it lands on heads to happen at the same time as event B that it lands on tails? Can it happen at the same time, land on heads and tails? So they're disjoint because those events cannot happen at the same time. Disjoint. Is it possible to flip a penny, event A, and for it to land on tails, event B? Can you flip a penny and it land on tails? No. Yes. So that would be an overlapping event. Could it land on heads too and be one or the other? Yeah. But the times when it happens together, those are overlapping events because they both happen. All right, is it possible to drive east and also to drive west at the same time? Events A and B. No, so those are disjoint. It's either one or the other. There's no possibility for you to do both. But is it possible for me, so that's disjoint, is it possible for me to drive east and also to stop at a red light? Events A and B. To drive east and stop at a red light? Yes. Is it possible to drive east and go through a green light? Yeah, so there's different outcomes, but those outcomes could possibly happen together, overlapping. Is it possible for me to spin a spinner and to land on an odd number and also land on a 4? Can I do both? Can both happen at the same time? No. Because 4 is not odd. All right, so disjoint. Is it possible for me to spin a spinner and spin a number less than 5, event A, so it's less than 5, and also to spin a 3? Yeah. So those are overlapping. All right, so those are some scenarios. On your homework tonight, you're going to be given some scenarios, and you have to tell me, is it overlapping or disjoint? You kind of see the difference? Disjoint can never happen together. They will have no shared outcomes. Overlapping could possibly have some shared outcomes. So we're going to look at this spinner example. We're going to play through several different scenarios. All right, I want you to go ahead and just write the spinner. You're going to use one spinner to answer several questions. You don't have to copy it every time I switch a slide, but this is the spinner that we're going to use. So go ahead and draw this on your notes. Okay. So here's my events. Event A is that I spin an odd number. Event B is that I spin a prime number. So the first thing I want to look at is, are there any outcomes that will be both odd and prime? That will be both of them. That'll help me determine, are these disjoint or overlapping? So is it possible for both of them to happen? For a number to be both odd and prime? Do you see any odd and prime numbers on there? What? What's an odd number that's also prime on the spinner? 7. Okay, there. As long as I have at least one, then these are overlapping events. They're overlapping. Okay? So now I'm going to start calculating the probabilities. The probability that event A happens, remember, whatever my targeted probability is, that's what I write in parentheses, equals, okay, so event A, spin an odd number. How many odd numbers are on the spinner? How many odd numbers do you see on the spinner? 4 out of how many total? 8. So now the probability of B. How many prime numbers do you see on the spinner? No, 7 is prime, 3 is prime, 2 is prime. There are 3 prime numbers out of 8 on the spinner. And now, since we said that there are some numbers on there that are both odd and prime, I need to figure out how many are both A and B. So how many numbers are there are on the spinner that are odd and prime, that are both? How many? How many odd prime numbers do you see? 7 is odd and prime. 3 is odd and prime. Anything else? So there are 2 numbers out of 8 that are both odd and prime. So here's how I calculate it. The probability now that I get one or the other. I want you to understand this. What I'm looking for is, what's the probability that I land on odd or a prime number? One or the other. So what I do is I add A and B together. What was my probability of A? What was my probability of A? 4 over 8. And B? 3 over 8. But since I'm trying to find one or the other, now I have to subtract out the ones where it happens together. So I have to subtract 2 over 8 because I don't want to know when it happens together. I want either or. So what's 4 plus 3 minus 2? 5 over 8 is my answer. All right? So I find the probability of event A and the probability of event B. If there are outcomes where they both could happen, I have to subtract that from my total to find the probability of A or B. All right, so now let's do another one. Same spinner. You don't have to write down a new spinner. We're using the same one as reference, but now we have 2 different events. Event A now is that I spin an even number, and event B is that I spin a prime number. All right, so let's try now. On your papers, I want you to tell me, are these events disjoint or overlapping? Go ahead and answer that part. Before we calculate anything, you need to decide disjoint or overlapping. All right, so the probability of A. What is the probability that I land on an even number? 4 out of 8. Did you write P of A equals 4 over 8? Did you write that? Now, P of B, probability of B, how many prime numbers are there? We already answered this in the last one. 3 out of 8. Are there any that happen together? How many happen together? So is it disjoint or overlapping? Overlapping. Because some of the events happen together, it is overlapping. All right, now I want you to calculate the probability. All right, so now, what do I write in parentheses before the equal sign?
A or B.
A or B equals, what do I write now? Plus 3/8 minus 1/8 equals 6/8, which is 3 over 4, 3/4, or 75%. All right? I don't know what happened there. Okay, any questions on calculating probability with overlapping events? All right, so now let's look at another one. On this one, let's look at the events. It says event A, that I spin a multiple of 3. In event B, that I spin a number greater than 5. Again, first thing I want you to decide, is it disjoint or overlapping? Then start calculating your probabilities. Are there any numbers on the spinner that are a multiple of 3 and also greater than 5? Yes, since your answer is yes, they are overlapping. They're overlapping again. All right, now that I've established that they're overlapping, I need to start calculating my probabilities. Do you have that done? What's the probability that event A happens that you land on a multiple of 3? 4 out of 8. What's the probability of event B happening? How many numbers on there are greater than 5? 5 out of 8. What's the probability of both happening? How many numbers are a multiple of 3 and also greater than 5? 6, 9, 15. 3 numbers on there meet that criteria. So 3 over 8. What do I do with these numbers now? I add together A or B, and then I subtract when both happen. And I get 6 over 8, or 3 over 4, or 3/4 again. All right, let's look at another scenario. Now here's your events. All right, first of all, decide if they're disjoint or overlapping, and then start calculating the probability. Here's my first question. Are there any even numbers that are also more than 9? So are the events, yes, disjoint. So the events are disjoint. All right, so here's what's just going to be a little different now. I still calculate the probability of A. How many even numbers are there? 4 out of 8. How many numbers are more than 9? Only 1. And since there are no common events, there are no events in common. You see that 0? That's not even necessary to write. All we do is add A and B together. Okay, so since there's no overlapping events, we just add A and B and we're done. 5 over 8. All right, now let's look at just a little bit of a different scenario. This is what your homework is going to look like. It's going to go ahead and tell you, so you don't have to look on a spinner and figure out, what the probability of A or B is. It's going to tell you straight out. So remember, if they're disjoint, what do you do with A and B? Do you subtract them? You add them together. That's all you do. So you're going to need to write, though, on your homework, P of A or B equals 2.4 plus 3 equals 5.4. All right? So what you're going to show on your homework, probability that I find A or B, show that you add them together, and then your total. It's literally going to be, you just add them together. Okay? All right, so here's another one. I want you to do this one. All right, make sure you write exactly how I have it highlighted. Make sure you show your work that way. Get? 8. Yeah, it's 8. Now, did you write it this way? Did you write it that way? Probability of A or B equals, add them together, 8. Okay? So that's one thing you're going to see. Another thing you're going to see is what we call complementary events. The probability that B happens given A. Here's what that means. If I tell you that there's a 60% chance of rain, what chance is there of it not raining? 40. You just subtract from 100. All right, so we use a total of 1, okay, whatever equals a whole. In that case, 100% would equal a whole, to calculate the probability that the other event would happen. So if I had a decimal I would subtract from what stands for a whole? 1. I would subtract from 1. If I had a fraction, how can I give me a fraction that would be equal to 1? Any fraction. 1 over 1. 5 over 5. 10 over 10. So if I were to give you one fraction and ask you to find the complementary fraction, you use your denominator to create a fraction that's equivalent to 1 and you subtract it. Okay, we'll do that more in a second. And then percentages, guys, that's probably the easiest one. You subtract from 100. All right, so let's go back up to number 1. If I want to find the complementary event to 0.4, what would I do? Subtract it from what?
1.
Subtract it from 1. All right, so 1 minus 0.4 equals what? 0.6. So what if that number was 0.2? What would its complementary be? If it was 0.2, it would be 0.8. You just subtract whatever that value is, you subtract it from 1 with decimals. Now with fractions, 2/5 is what I have to subtract from. So what fraction would I want to create here that would be equivalent to 1? 5 over 5. Why use 5 over 5? Because your denominators. Why would you do 6 over 6 and you have to find an LCD? Right? So that's why I said use your denominators to create that fraction. Now what's 5 minus 2? 3/5. All right, now what about the percentage? Subtract from 100. All right, any questions on how we find the complementary events? You have 6 of these on your homework tonight. It's a third of your homework assignment. Okay? All right, now I want you to do 3. I'm just going to give you different numbers. I want you to do these 3. Go ahead and calculate them. Okay, so what do you subtract 0.15 from? 1. What do you get?
0.85.
Very good. What do you subtract 7/10 from? 10 tenths. And what do you get? All right, what do you subtract 60% from? And what do you get? Okay, so that's pretty much everything you need to know for 13.5.